Hello, I am Ramayad, Director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, and I would like to welcome you to the New American Engagement Initiative's Future Foreign Policy Discussion. NAEA is a part of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, which works to develop sustainable nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and partners. Um, just for the start, let me tell you something. I have been appointed as a director of the Africa Center since 2 months now. And since I have taken the office, the New American Engagement Initiative is certainly the council's program that fascinates me the most. I hope the others will forgive me, but I must confess, my feeling is that this initiative is a challenge for the entire council. It prevents us from resting on our laurels. It stimulates us. It challenges us. It is what a think tank should be, a structure composed of free spirits, welcome to criticism, open to dialogue without taboos. And for someone like me, usually seen as the rebel of French politics, it is quite disturbing to know that there is more rebellious than oneself. But the initiative does not provoke to provoke. It is an organization that advances the debate and proposes to change the paradigm and never to have a one-sided view of events. That is the way I would like to run the Africa Center. And that is why I get along well with the members of the initiative, and I'm so happy to be here. I understand what drives them and the challenges as well. Because it's risky to be a free spirit, but is it still American? That is the key question. Karen Gray, our guest, she's a research associate at the Eurasia Group Foundation. Caroline studied international affairs and political economy. As she was fascinated by India, she worked with the Brookings Institution in New Delhi, assisting their foreign policy fellow on a book about the history of Indian foreign policy. In Washington, D.C., she joined the policy team at the Truman National Security Project, a progressive national security think tank. There, she developed an engagement strategy for the 2020 election cycle. She also helped develop foreign policy and national security platforms for the 2020 candidates and manage expert groups covering a wide range of subjects, including energy and climate security, development and diplomacy, and Asia and Africa. Like I said, faithful to this vocation, the initiative now welcomes Caroline Gray for a risky conversation on the US reputation in the world. It is indeed risky to ask foreigners what they think of your country, of this country, after these last years and even this last month. Remember the capital. This attitude can be interpreted in two ways. Or you don't want to know anything about your country because you fear the answer, or you want to know because you want to improve things. I even find this option patriotic because there is a way to improvement in the United States. It's even its vocation to be improvable. I'm a foreigner, and Caroline could have interviewed me. I spent my life feeling foreign where I was, including in Europe, mainly in France, where I was raised. Even being French, even being minister representing France on the United Nations Security Council, it is tricky. This country has brought me to the highest office, but at the same time, sometimes its view on me, of me, remains suspicious. Today, I'm enjoying the American dream with the honor of leading a program in a major think tank. It's not often that this position is offered to a foreigner, and every day I enjoy the honor. But next Saturday, it is Juneteenth. And yesterday at the State Department, and I had to remember alongside Akuna Cook, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and NACCP CEO Derek Johnson, to remind myself that this country abducted my ancestors to enslave them and segregated them. And then I had to remember that next to my fascination with Hollywood and the NBA, I had to remember that from Dakar and Paris, I lived with the memory of Rodney King in the 80s and now George Floyd. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. This is an extract from The Hill We Climb by Amanda Gorman, the young poet at Biden's presidential inauguration. Unfinished, she said. America is an unfinished nation. So whatever you may say, dear Caroline Gray, know that this nation is not finished. I represent Africa here, the oldest continent, but also the youngest continent. And in this double capacity, it represents wisdom and innovation, yesterday and tomorrow, the new frontier, separated from America by the common border that is the Atlantic. It is with this double look that Africans, the most recent wave of immigration to the United States, look at this country. The past for the negation of human dignity, the future, because when Africans want to succeed, they come to America. And that means that the American dream is still very strong. Christopher, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Yeah, that is an incredibly hard act to follow, but I'm going to do the very best I can. Thank you so much for joining us today and for those wonderful remarks at the outset. Let's turn to the rest of our program. I'm Christopher Preble. I'm the co-director of the New American Engagement Initiative here at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And I'm here to talk to Caroline Gray, Research Associate at the Eurasia Group Foundation. Rama already told you a little bit about Caroline. She is the co-author, most recently with Mark Hanna of the Eurasia Group Foundation, of the report Democracy in Disarray, How the World Sees the US and Its Example. I should mention, in addition to her writing and research, that Caroline is also the producer of one of my favorite podcasts, None of the Above. I'm a huge fan, and so if you're not already a subscriber, give it a listen. So Caroline, let's turn it over to you. I think you wanted to just say a little bit more about EGF, and then we can dig into the report. And then I'll say right at the outset, and I'll remind you along the way, for those of you who are watching and joining us today, thank you so much. If you'd like to ask a question, you can drop it in the Q&A, and we'll take your questions at the bottom of the hour. So Caroline, thanks again for joining us. Please tell us just a little bit about EGF.
Sure. Let me just say first, thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, Ambassador Ramayad and Ode, and to the Scowcroft Center for inviting me to participate in this wonderful event. It definitely feels fitting that we'll be talking about this new report, which my colleague Mark Hanna and I recently co-authored, since the purpose of this series is to question and investigate some of the key underlying assumptions that guide US foreign policy. This report and the data we found certainly helps us do that. So a little bit of background on my organization, the Eurasia Group Foundation. We're a relatively young nonprofit. Political scientist Ian Bremmer, who you all may know as the founder and president of the Eurasia Group, founded the Eurasia Group Foundation back in 2016 with the purpose of making geopolitics and foreign policy accessible and understandable to a diverse range of audiences. So we not only produce white papers and reports like the one we'll be discussing today, but like Chris mentioned, we produce a podcast, we produce films, we're heavily engaged in the social media space, all with the hope that we'll reach people kind of beyond those who might typically engage in these debates and discussions.
Great, thanks, Caroline. So let's just start on the report. I dug into this really from the moment it was released and was really intrigued, and it included responses from people in 10 very different countries, including both US allies and adversaries, as well as countries that we might reasonably describe in the old Cold War fashion as non-aligned. For the viewers who haven't yet seen the report, the surveys were conducted in the following countries in alphabetical order: Brazil, China, Egypt, Germany, India, Japan, Mexico, Nigeria, Poland, and Russia. So I think we'd be hard pressed to find 10 more diverse countries. So let's just, for starters, Caroline, Tell us a little bit about the methodology. How did you go about doing these surveys, and when did you conduct those surveys? During what time period?
Sure. So we conducted this survey during the first 3 weeks of March 2021. So this was after President Biden took office. This was also before President Biden's announcement of the Afghanistan withdrawal, which we asked a question about. We polled over 5,000 adults in these 10 countries that you just mentioned. We ensured gender and age diversity and made sure it was representative of the demographic makeup of these countries. And a little bit more about kind of the impetus behind the report. We asked a series of questions about the US, about US style democracy, and also America's influence in people's country or region. And we thought this was important at a time when, President Biden is attempting to redefine America's role in the world after it's been tested, after American democracy at home has been tested. So we thought these kinds of questions were important to ask, including, is the US still a model democracy for countries around the world? Can we still lead in the same ways that we used to? And also, how can we better lead?
So great, thank you. So let's get into the substance just a bit. What findings really stood out to you? What were the sort of headline, 2 or 3 headline findings from the report?
Sure, I'll share a few key findings, 3 that I found most important in kind of setting the stage here. So the first is that generally the US continues to enjoy the goodwill of people from across the globe. Respondents were 85% more likely to register a favorable rather than an unfavorable opinion of the US. Of course, there's a lot of nuance there. People in Nigeria and Brazil, for instance, tend to have extremely positive views of the US, whereas people in China and Germany tend to have much more negative views. But I think that's an important starting point, that in general, perception of the US remains positive, despite there being much the US can do to improve its standing and its credibility in the world. All that being said, another major finding of ours is that American hard power tends to hinder positive perceptions of the US and US democracy, whereas American soft power tends to do the opposite, and it tends to increase support for the US and US democracy. And I'd love to get into the specifics of that later on, but essentially what we found is that things like disapproving of America's war in Afghanistan or holding negative views of US interventionism tends to drive unfavorable views, whereas people who have a connection to their country's diaspora in the US or who consume American news or cultural products, they're much more likely to hold pro-American attitudes. And lastly, I'd like to share a finding that has to do with China, since the rise of China is really dominating kind of the foreign policy space right now. With all the concern and fear surrounding the rise of China and China's growing influence, it's noteworthy that a large majority of respondents we surveyed, 81% in fact, continue to prefer American to Chinese global leadership. Now, of course, this could change over time, and we want to, focus on this and pay attention to this over the years. But it strikes me as important when discussing America's standing in the world and the potential challenge China poses to it.
I certainly agree. 81% finding in any survey is shocking. So that is very good news. To the extent that that was a surprise, that's one. Were there any other big surprises for you? Were there some things that you expected to see that didn't, or things that really jumped out at you as unexpected?
Yeah, I mean, in light of President Biden's trip to Europe this week and last week to restore the transatlantic alliance, to reset relations, with the G7 after the fraying of relations under President Trump, and also the emphasis the Biden administration and past administrations have put on, our allies and our partners. It was really surprising that 2 of our most important allies, Germany and Japan, tend to have, really kind of unfavorable views of the US, more so than some adversarial countries like China and Russia. It raises a lot of questions about, what does that say about working closely with our partners to counter the threats we face if the people who are supposed to be our strongest supporters are our greatest skeptics? President Biden has made clear that we need our partners and our allies to restore democracy globally in this fight against, authoritarianism. So it's certainly kind of concerning and surprising that these two allies in particular are so skeptical of US and US foreign policy.
I think we'd have to get into a bit of speculation on this, but it would be, you did conduct this survey just a few, really just a few weeks, not even 2 full months since President Biden had taken office. And we certainly could speculate on what that might mean if you were to do the surveys. And I think it's particularly in Germany and Japan, for example, some of that is an overhang of the Trump years, but that's, again, we're sort of speculating a little bit. A reminder to those of you who are watching, if you have a question, please drop it in the Q&A function and we'll get to your question at the bottom of the hour. Caroline, you alluded to this in your remarks a few minutes ago, but let's drill down into the details a bit more on the link between US-led military interventions and anti-American sentiment. In those places where anti-American sentiment is relatively high, what is the relationship that you see? Can you describe a pattern? And especially, I think, how is that relevant to US policymakers? What advice might you give to US policymakers to be more aware of how public perceptions around the world pertaining to US military intervention and whether or not they should consider those in deciding whether or not to intervene militarily?
Sure, yeah, it's a really important question and one we definitely focused on when writing this report. There are a few data points I'd like to draw everyone's attention to better understand this link. We asked respondents a question about what would make American-style democracy more attractive, and we provided them with 10 answer options. And what we found is that people who think that a more restrained US foreign policy would make American democracy more attractive, those people are the most likely to have an unfavorable view of the United States. What this suggests is that US interventionism does not lead to favorable opinions on average. Rather, it has a relationship with anti-American views and anti-US sentiment. And that isn't, terribly surprising given the kind of failures of America's wars in the Middle East over the last 2 decades. Definitely raises a lot of questions about America's current military footprint, America's defense budget, its reliance on the Pentagon in solving national security challenges. Another data point that should suggest this link as well has to do with the war in Afghanistan, which I mentioned previously. Like I said, we fielded this survey before President Biden's announcement that the war would be coming to an end. We asked respondents whether the US should keep its troops in Afghanistan until the country stabilizes or remove them as soon as possible. Now, the breakdown is relatively even. About 40% believe in keeping troops in Afghanistan. The other 40 believe they should be removed, and about 20% didn't report an opinion. So we were curious, of course, whether this contributed to or influenced positive or negative perceptions of the US. And what we found is that those who believe that US troops should be withdrawn were on average about 2.5 times more likely to have an unfavorable view of the US than those who supported troops staying in the country. So there does seem to be a connection between the disapproval of America's war there and unfavorable views of the US. Now, whether or not that means policymakers should consider this link when deciding to intervene militarily or not, again, it raises a lot of questions about what the national security goals of the US are and whether or not the policies align with what those goals are trying to achieve. If you're trying to make the US democratic model more attractive to countries around the world in this contest against autocracy, which is how President Biden has, that's how he's really forming his foreign policy approach. And if you're trying to gain the goodwill of people around the world, then you might reconsider basing much of your policy on military intervention and US hard power and think about alternative tools for conducting foreign policy. And just one last note, of course, not all aspects of US hard power are bad. We're not interpreting the data to suggest that the military or our defense posture is unnecessary, but it's something to think about in terms of how we decide to lead going forward, I think.
Right, very well said. I think related to the question of US hard power, even if we sort of separate out military interventions and the war in Afghanistan being the most recent case that you had in mind in this survey, there's also some polling around US military bases. Some of the survey respondents sort of view U.S. military bases as a threat to their country's sovereignty and independence. Can you talk us through a little bit about what your polling found with respect to the U.S. military presence as distinct from U.S. military intervention?
Sure. So I'll start with our question about how people view different types of American influence. We asked about things like influence of the U.S. military, the influence of Western education models, American diplomats and embassies, American consumer products, things like that. And what we found, maybe unsurprisingly, is that the most positive types of influence were economic in nature, things like investment from private American companies and the importation of American consumer products, whereas things like the sale of American military weapons, for instance, were among the least positive types of US influence. We did, like you mentioned, ask a question about whether people feel US military bases threaten their country's independence. And I'll highlight a few countries that stood out with respect to this question. Roughly 70% of people in China believe US military basing in their region threatens their independence. Again, not terribly surprising given the geopolitical tensions between these two countries. But again, it makes you kind of question whether building up US military bases in East Asia is the smartest strategy to counter China, or if doing so might exacerbate, existing tensions between our two countries. Another country is Egypt. We found similar findings. The majority of Egyptians think the US military in their region threatens their independence. Again, that's interesting in light of, the US pouring billions of dollars into that relationship over the last few decades. And even people in India tend to share this view as well, even though they hold overwhelmingly positive views of the US and US democracy. And lastly, again, the data here is very nuanced. For instance, people in Nigeria think the US military has created a lot of stability in the world and in their region, and that they should be used, to stop human rights abuses, and they do feel safer because of America's presence. So it's not a completely clear picture, but those are some interesting findings for sure.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the findings from Nigeria were really interesting and stood out to me, and I think worthy of perhaps a whole show or Rama, more for us to talk about together between the Africa Center and AEI. We've talked already about how when you frame a question to respondents as whether people prefer the United States to China, and the United States does relatively well, 81%, which is striking. But how well can we assess the possibility that foreign publics hold a positive or negative views towards both countries simultaneously? Or are we setting this up artificially? And I'm not saying you did this in the survey. I'm saying, is the foreign policy community setting this up as an either or proposition when it may also be, or does the poll results find this, that countries are really not wanting to be in a position of having to choose either or?
That's a really interesting question. The foreign policy community definitely kind of sets this up in a binary way. Do you prefer the US or China? It's kind of this bipolar world that we're framing, and we certainly kind of dove into that in the report by asking a question about whether people prefer a US-led world order or a China-led world order. Of course, those aren't the only two options. It's not like people necessarily think about that question every day. And maybe we can ask or include more answer options in future years to get a better sense of that.
Right.
Yeah, but that's a really interesting point.
Well, related to that too is the issue of soft power. Your report emphasizes and demonstrates the continued appeal of U.S. soft power, but we also see that China's soft power has grown and in some places is outpacing that of the United States. How would you describe the comparison between the United States and China in terms of how they employ soft power? And again, can we make any assessments in terms of how effective our approach is versus China's, and what we might need to do differently in the future? And I will say we've got about 5 minutes more for you to get questions. For those of you watching About 5 more minutes and we'll turn it over to audience Q&A. So if you do have a question, please drop it in the Q&A. So let's talk a little bit about more about soft power, and especially China versus U.S. soft power. Caroline, what were some of the findings there?
Sure. Yeah, like I'll say again that, even despite China's aggressive, Belt and Road Initiative and their increasing influence with respect to soft power, the U.S. is still, preferred to a large extent. I think Germany is an interesting example. There's a lot of fears of China making inroads in Europe with 5G, with tech, with trade, and 9 in 10 people in Germany still prefer a U.S.-led world order to one led by China. So that's important. Something we found is that, or something we think, or that the data suggests, is that the U.S. can be doing more to focus on strengthening its soft power strategies. I mentioned earlier that people who have a connection to their country's diaspora in the U.S., if they've traveled here, if they've lived here, have friends and family here, those people are significantly more likely to have a positive view of the U.S. We don't necessarily have to, justify a more open immigration policy in the name of great power competition with China, but it certainly wouldn't hurt us if we are framing it in this kind of way. Another thing that's interesting are looking at the rationales between preferring a U.S. to a China-led world order. You might think that people prefer the U.S. Because of values, because of democracy, human rights, which is what President Biden talks a lot about, but it's really based on economics. It's economic in nature. It's really based on these material interests. Can the U.S., provide a stable global economy, trade, et cetera? Those are things I think people are really concerned with, and the future administration should be focused on in this contest.
Right. Well, related to this, unfortunately, of course, we're continuing to have this discussion under the cloud of COVID-19, although here in the United States, the situation is improving, but in much of the rest of the world, they're still really struggling. Vaccine rollouts in many other parts of the world are well behind. We've made the case through NAEI, my colleagues Matt Burrows and Evan Cooper in particular, talking about the importance of US vaccine diplomacy and things like that. But to the best of our ability, can we separate out, or can we isolate the impact of COVID-19, the US response to it, on the effect that it had on public perceptions towards the United States? And do you think it's possible, to the extent that some of the weakness or doubt about the U.S. Ability to prevail, is it possible that some of those doubts might be mitigated by some of the recent moves by the Biden administration to accelerate vaccine distribution globally?
Yeah, I mean, I think the simple answer is yes, and I think that the data backs that up. We did ask a question about America's response to the coronavirus and whether or not the U.S. served as a good example or as a bad example at managing this outbreak. Overall, about 60% of respondents we surveyed thought America's response was a bad example, compared to about 40% who thought it was a good example. So it's not a great picture, especially since people in countries like Japan and Germany were equally as pessimistic as people in places like China and Russia. But through more rigorous data analysis, we found that people who thought the US handled the coronavirus pandemic poorly were 27% more likely to prefer a China-led world order than people thought who handled it well. So there does appear to be some link, some connection between negative perceptions of the US and how it handled COVID-19 and actually the gains China is making as a leader. And to me, that suggests that the Biden administration's move to increase the distribution of vaccines globally, along with G7 nations, would definitely help its standing as a leading power, as a trustworthy power. But beyond that, I also think it shows that the US needs to be more concerned about how it handles crises at home, to be able to better serve as a model, because people around the world are watching, and it definitely has an impact on how they view our leadership and our credibility.
Right, very well said. Again, the key sub-theme within this report and in the subtitle is the importance of modeling democracy. So I think we can't say that often enough, but I think that's a really good point at which to sort of transition our discussion. I want to turn it over to my colleague, Ms. Aude Darnall. She's Associate Director here at the New American Engagement Initiative, and she's going to help with questions from you in the audience. Again, if you do have a question, please feel to drop it into the Q&A function. Aude, take it away.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for Caroline for this great discussion. I want to start the discussion with widening a bit the countries that we've been talking about. So we've been talking about Russia and China, but what can you tell us, Caroline, about India? The findings that you found on India, were there any surprising findings there, and how this could be different today from a few months ago when you conducted the survey? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, and glad to be doing this Q&A with you, Aude. The findings out of India were overwhelmingly positive, like they were in Nigeria. People there have a very positive perception of the U.S., of U.S. democracy, and also of U.S. foreign policy. Like I mentioned, it's a bit nuanced in the sense that the majority of people there believe that America's military presence threatens their independence, and that's not completely surprising given, India's history and kind of antipathy towards, foreign powers having a big influence in their country. But they certainly have a positive view, and I wish we could run this survey again, and it'll certainly be telling next year because of how horribly COVID has ravaged that country. It'll be interesting to see how people's perceptions of the U.S. changed in that regard if we came to their aid early enough, if we did enough to help them and to help all countries around the world. It'll be really telling in next year's survey to see how that changes based on our response worldwide. It still kind of remains to be seen how people think about that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And talking about AIDS, what could the U.S. change about its foreign policy, and not just the messaging that could improve its image around the world? And if I can tie this up to the question of soft power, what kinds of U.S. soft power are more highly rated than others?
Yeah, another great and important question. Like I mentioned, we asked people about different kinds of American influence, military influence being kind of the least positive, and economic influence being the most positive. So things like private investments by U.S. companies. It makes me think of trade. It makes me think of U.S. kind of cultural influence in countries. People reported, who watch American news or movies have a higher opinion of the U.S. So I think all those things are important, and it makes me think about, what we can do to, better our public diplomacy efforts or cultural exchange efforts. I think those are all important things. But in terms of America's image and its credibility, I mean, a lot of it I think has to do, and the data supports this in a sense, to ensure that our democracy at home is healthy and thriving. People take note of that, and if we're seen as hypocritical, if we're seen as criticizing a country like Russia or China on their human rights abuses, but aren't holding ourselves to the same or similar standard at home, that can cause some issues for our image and credibility. So that's another important thing that we should be focusing on, and I think the Biden administration, at least in its rhetoric, is attempting to focus on that.
Mm-hmm. And just to, as a reminder for our participants, so the 10 countries surveyed were Brazil, China, Egypt, Germany, India, Japan, Mexico, Nigeria, Poland, and Russia. And I want to continue with talking, maybe still going beyond China, Russia, just talking about allies and U.S. allies, given that President Biden has underlined his intention to go back to multilateralism and working with allies. What can you tell us about what is driving the growing unfavorable opinion of American democracy in allied industrial countries?
Yeah, a very important question. I'll give a few more data points on countries like Germany and Japan. So, I mean, the good news is with Germany is that negative views did decrease this past year, which is likely attributable to election of Joe Biden, since President Trump did seem particularly unpopular among German respondents last year. That being said, fewer than 1/4 of Germans approve of American democracy, which is not a lot. And nearly half of Germans disagree with the statement that America's democracy sets a positive example for the world. I'm not quite sure why that is. Germans, based on the data, show that they actually have a lot of confidence in their own system of government and their own democracy. So that could potentially explain why they're more critical of others and want to hold a country like the US to a higher standard. But even more surprising beyond what they think of US democracy is that 40% of Germans surveyed think that US influence has made little or no difference in the world. And again, that's really surprising considering the importance we place on relations with a country like Germany, with the EU, with our NATO allies, that they don't think we're making that big of an impact. It's a similar story in Japan. We've been treaty allies with Japan since 1960, and only 3 in 10 people in Japan had a favorable view of the US more generally. Most of their feelings are pretty neutral towards us. And 40% of people in Japan also think that US influence really hasn't made a difference in the world. So again, it really makes you question whether we have the backing of the people we're supposed to be working, so closely with. It doesn't feel like a great vote of confidence for the US and multilateralism. But again, we could see that change in future years as we reestablish relations.
And and just again going back to the pro-American sentiment, I think there's an interesting question in the Q&A, is to aid US foreign policy, should we be focusing on increasing pro-American sentiment abroad, or should we instead be focusing on increasing pro-democracy sentiment abroad? So, in your findings, what can you tell us about the difference between this American sentiment versus democracy sentiment? So let's say instead of focusing on pro-American sentiment, we would be focusing on democracy support through Europe, the Western world in general, thus indirectly increasing US support.
That's a great question. I think this two are certainly related in the sense that, a policy of the United States for decades has been the promotion of democracy, wanting to spread democracy around the world. And of course that, has failed in multiple places when we've attempted to do that through military means, through hard power. And I think what we are interested in and moving towards is a democracy promotion strategy that's based on modeling, good democratic behaviors, good democratic institutions, good practices here at home. And so when you have when we start to shore up our own democratic institutions here, that could, and people see that, the US is making gains in that regard. Hopefully that will help spread or help people move towards their own model of democracy that works for their country.
Mm-hmm. And talking about those different forms of governance, so is there a relationship between the form of governments of the respondent countries and their views of the US? Is the US more popular in democracies versus autocracies? Is that an indicator?
Another really interesting question. I mean, countries like Germany and Japan, which are very strong democracies, have very unfavorable views of US democracy, and countries like China and Russia, which are more authoritarian, have more favorable views than those countries. So I don't think we can say for certain that countries that are democratic have less favorable views and countries that are not have more favorable views. But it's certainly interesting. I pulled some data about Russia. Even though Russia is people in Russia are incredibly skeptical of the US, of US influence, of US foreign policy, people in Russia have a really positive view of the American people. More people in Russia like than dislike American democracy. So it's interesting. It's not all negative in these countries we have adversarial relations with.
And I think, and as Chris was mentioning me as well, one of the findings suggests that most of the respondents believe they live in democracy. So I think that's also quite a tricky indicator to analyze. And just maybe we have 3 minutes left, so I'm just gonna maybe go to one or two last questions. So post G7, it appears that both the US and its allies are set once again to use each other, collaborate. So, given that the EU, is increasingly concerned about Russia and its American continued commitment and support, the question mentions military commitment in particular, and on the other side, the US focuses more on China and its a broader Western support. Do you see any of this reflected in your survey results?
Whether or not it's reflected in our survey results, I mean, again, even though China is making inroads in Europe, like I said, in places like Germany, Germans are still overwhelmingly in favor of a US-led world order. You know, what I see is that, you know, people in Europe aren't as concerned with China, like you mentioned, as the US is. But I'm not sure any data we have supports that kind of discrepancy. Maybe we could ask a question about that in future years, since that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think we are running out of time. So thank you, Caroline, and thank you for our participants for those questions. I think it was a great discussion. I'm going to hand it over back to Chris for the concluding remarks. Thanks you again, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Aude.
You are muted, Chris.
There we go. Sorry about that. Thank you, Aude, and thanks all the participants, including Ambassador Ramayad and Caroline Gray. I'd also like to give a special shout out to NAI Associate Director Evan Cooper and Young Global Professional Warisha Siddiqui for their help, the logistics on this event. And I also want to thank you, the viewers, for joining us today. As a reminder, the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security's New American Engagement Initiative challenges prevailing assumptions governing U.S. foreign policy and helps policymakers manage risks, set priorities, and allocate resources wisely and efficiently. The United States confronts a range of national security challenges, but the marketplace of ideas defines these too expansively, fails to prioritize them effectively, and limits the range of options for addressing them. So unconventional thinking is needed to help Americans put some of these dangers in perspective and encourage them to embrace global engagement through diplomacy, trade, and mutually beneficial cultural exchange. And that's the core of our mission here at the New American Engagement Initiative. Our Future Foreign Policy series aims to foster discussions like this one that touch on some of the key assumptions that have guided U.S. foreign policy. And we routinely engage in a critical assessment of those policies that flow from these assumptions. So if you like this discussion and you'd like to learn more about the series or about NAEI, please visit our page at the Atlantic Council website and check back often for fresh content and information about future events. Thank you.